From a strategic meeting in eastern Russia to some exceptional anniversaries. This week, the world watched as Kim Jong-un met Vladimir Putin. Russia needs weapons for its war in Ukraine. North Korea wants satellites and submarine technology in return. Where might their military cooperation leave the world? Also on the program, we'll look back at the impact of the war in Iraq 22 years after the September 11th attacks. And we'll ask what has changed in Iran a year after the death of Mahsa Amini. Plus, 50 years since Chile's General Augusto Pinochet took power in a military coup. What do Chileans remember, and where does the country stand today? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia allowed its Cold War alliance with North Korea to lapse, cutting vital aid. The Kremlin went on to back several rounds of UN sanctions against Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs. But the two countries, now both under stringent sanctions, find themselves with common enemies and strategic assets to offer each other. And so the world watched while Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un met in eastern Russia this week.
Здравствуйте. Привет. Рад вас видеть. Как вы добрались? Я с Михаилом Шестика. Спасибо, что на свою занятость пригласили нас и тепло приняли.
The two leaders kicked off their meeting touring the Vostochny Cosmodrome, an opportunity for President Putin to show off Russia's weapons technology. Kim has tried to put a spy satellite into orbit twice in the past 6 months and failed. A spy satellite could help North Korea track its enemies, monitor incoming threats, and potentially plot attacks more accurately.
Of course, we need to discuss the issues of economic cooperation and humanitarian issues, as well as the situation in the region. We have a lot of issues to discuss.
We were able to see with our own eyes the present and the future of Russia as a space power. We have constantly expressed our full and unconditional support for all the decisions taken by the President and the Russian leadership. And I want to assure you that we will always be together with Russia in the fight against imperialism.
Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department has warned North Korea will pay a price should there be a full arms deal with Russia.
In terms of what our reaction will be to it, so we're going to monitor very closely the outcome of this meeting. I will remind both countries that any transfer of arms from North Korea to Russia would be in violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. And we, of course, have aggressively enforced our sanctions against entities that fund Russia's war effort, and we will continue to enforce those sanctions and will not hesitate to impose new sanctions if appropriate.
So how might the West react to the strengthening relationship between two countries some consider rogue states? Here's what Sung-Yoon Lee, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, had to say.
Well, Russia, China, North Korea are also in the top 10 in terms of world's military power. So this is a very big bloc, ending with a C, in a standoff against another very big bloc. So the danger of miscalculation and a small triggering incident that might spark a war, one cannot discount that and has to be very concerned about such possibility, even if it's a low one. But again, North Korea is really the driver. We tend not to think of North Korea as the more proactive party. The Biden administration, the South Korean administration have repeatedly called for talks without preconditions, not just denuclearization talks, but it's Kim Jong-un who has said, no, thank you. And his sister, Kim Yo-jong, has issued several statements saying even if the U.S. were to propose to withdraw U.S. troops from South Korea, the fact that U.S. could reverse that action within days means we're not interested in talking to you right now. So North Korea will come out beaming smiles and call for talks when it wants to. It's just that now is not the time.
Yulia, let me ask you from Russia's perspective, is is Moscow just getting more and more comfortable with the fact that it might not have any sort of real working relationship anymore with Western powers? Is it comfortable now with having this other axis of power and strengthening it to make it work for Russia, i.e. the same kind of Cold War dynamics that they were used to for so many decades?
We have been declaring this pivot to Asia for decades already, starting with Foreign Minister Primakov in the late 90s. But the pivot wasn't exactly materializing. It wasn't real at the beginning. And now it has to get serious. And I think that Russia is getting more comfortable with that and more firm in its ambition and steadiness in how it's going into Asia. So I think that the disillusionment phase has already, so it's done now. So like, it's not that Russia's hoping to get back to normal with the West. It's just trying to move on.
Interesting. I mean, Jenny, I don't want to exaggerate, but that is, quite sad when we look in hindsight, to the collapse of the Soviet Union and how much hope there was for a stronger uni-global dynamic and the end, finally, of that kind of polarization. But now, when we're seeing, as we said before, Russia, North Korea pushed further into corners on the opposite side, this constant combative stance coming from the West toward, powers like China, Russia, North Korea, it doesn't bode well for the future of what used to be a one-planet globalization outlook, does it?
It doesn't. We are moving into, more rigidity amongst these blocks, and it's going to be very difficult going forward to reach across those blocks in convincing and compelling ways. And that makes for a very dangerous environment. How do we find now a new equilibrium in the region? How do we create a new sort of normal to help prevent this endless arms racing that we're seeing going on right now? I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And until we figure that out, again, the risks of misperception, miscalculation, as Professor Lee alluded to, these risks are continuing to grow, and the region itself is becoming more dangerous.
Well, protests over the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody 1 year ago spiraled into the worst political and social turmoil since the Iranian Revolution. Demonstrations were fueled by claims that she died due to an existing medical condition, while her family said she'd been beaten. In the unrest that followed, rights groups say 500 people were killed, hundreds wounded, and thousands arrested. 7 people with links to the protests were executed. In the immediate aftermath, Iran's morality police disappeared from the streets, but have since returned, along with surveillance cameras, as the government continues cracking down on dress codes and dissent. Here's a look.
1 year ago, an unknown Iranian woman was arrested stepping out of a train station in Tehran, allegedly for wearing her hijab incorrectly. 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in police custody 3 days later. Her death sparked demonstrations across the country that would turn into a revolt against the regime itself. Protesters burned their hijabs on the street, torched police vehicles, and chanted death to the dictator, defying the country's supreme leader. Thousands of people around the world joined demonstrations to show their support, with women posting videos of themselves on social media, cutting their hair off in a show of solidarity.
For 43 years, the people of Iran have been oppressed, and now they're coming together as never before for the rights of women. This is a moment in history, and we are all rallying behind them. Not just Iranians, but people of the world are rallying behind this topic because we want freedom for the people of Iran.
The government restricted messaging apps, while security forces launched a violent crackdown using tear gas, clubs, and even live ammunition. The paramilitary Basij group took a leading role in quashing dissent. According to human rights groups, more than 500 people were killed and thousands arrested. 7 people with links to the protests were executed, with dozens more reportedly charged with capital offenses or sentenced to death. Days before the anniversary, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi defended the government's response.
Those who intend to abuse Madame Amini's name under this pretext to be an agent of foreigners to create this instability in the country, we know what would happen to them. And they know that endangering the security of the people and security of society will create a big cost.
After Amini's death, more women began disobeying Iran's hijab laws, and the controversial morality police disappeared. But they have now returned, along with security cameras to identify unveiled women. And the government is pushing harsher regulations. If a new bill passes, a woman could face up to 10 years in prison for defying dress code laws, a sentence comparable to murder and drug trafficking. Businesses serving them could be shut down.
The draft law could be described as a form of gender apartheid, as authorities appear to be governing through systematic discrimination with the intention of suppressing women and girls into total submission.
The unrest has also hit the economy, already under heavy Western sanctions. The rial has plunged to an all-time low, with inflation skyrocketing, leaving many Iranians struggling to make ends meet.
It's getting worse every day. People are having hard lives. Our authorities should first provide good economic conditions. Hijab is a completely secondary and personal issue.
The government is taking measures to prevent more protests of the anniversary. Security forces have put up checkpoints and restricted the internet. Rights groups say several activists have been detained. And Mahsa Amini's father has been interrogated by police, while her uncle was arrested last week. But even if the Islamic Republic can keep demonstrators off the streets, have authorities made the underlying issues go away?
So what's changed in Iran? Negar Mortazavi is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, a journalist, and also the host of the Iran podcast. She says the protests were a revolution.
We saw a feminist uprising. The spark of it was the death or killing in custody of this young Kurdish woman because of how she was dressed. Let's not forget, Mahsa Amini was arrested because of what she was wearing, which to many, even religious and traditional Iranians, looked pretty okay. And people were puzzled by why exactly would this woman have to be arrested, detained, and eventually die because of how she was dressed. So I think women, girls, and allies showed up for her, for this unknown young Kurdish woman from a small town, to say enough is enough. This imposition of a mandatory dress code that's been going on for 4 decades on Iranian women, and they've slowly pushed back on the limits of it. I think this was a watershed moment, and they pushed the state back, essentially saying you can't kill someone for how they're dressed. And so what we saw in the past year is a transformation. Many women, many girls, and this is not just in Tehran, not just in big cities. I hear from many smaller cities, even traditional religious areas, that they have bravely defied this dress code and are coming into public with the Islamic hijab, as you were saying. Not everyone feels safe, but what I hear when I talk to women is when they see each other, when they see other women and other girls more and more doing it, they feel safer. And let me also add that there's a portion of the religious and traditional part of the society that sympathizes with that. I've spoken to women who wear the hijab themselves out of choice, but they don't support this form of harassment, of public violence against women in the name of morality police, and they support their sisters and daughters and granddaughters' right to choose to not wear the hijab. I think that's what the government has been missing for 4 decades, and that's what, with the death in custody of this woman, the population tried to show them with a big push, and we're not going back to before September 2022.
Well, it's been 22 years since the world watched in utter shock as 2 commercial jetliners crashed into New York's Twin Towers. Even greater horror set in when both 110-story buildings fell to the ground, killing some 3,000 people. The anniversary was marked on Monday across attack sites at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. President Joe Biden spoke at a military base in Anchorage, Alaska, using the occasion to call for unity.
The soul of America is the fortitude we found in the fear of that terrible September day, the purpose we found in our pain, the light we found in our darkest hour, an hour when terrorists believed they could bring us to our knees, bend our will, break our resolve. But they were wrong. They were dead wrong. In the crucible of 9/11 and the days and months that followed, we saw the stuff America's made of.
But the military response to the 9/11 attacks would challenge that fortitude and purpose, both at home and abroad. With extensive international support, Afghanistan was invaded to take down the Taliban and the al-Qaeda terrorists hiding there. But a year and a half later, in a move that broke with international law and consensus, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Just 6 weeks after U.S. troops entered the country and overthrew its leader, Saddam Hussein, U.S. President George W. Bush would announce mission accomplished. But Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that formed the premise for war were never found, and U.S. troops would ultimately spend upwards of a decade in the country. But instead of delivering the promised democracy, the invasion set Iraq on a path toward devastating security, political, and economic crises. So how do U.S. soldiers view the response and the war in Iraq? Well, I spoke with Jesse Damsky, who was deployed to Iraq in 2004 with the U.S. Army. He explained how his perspective on the war changed.
On one hand, as a young soldier, I was excited about the prospect of being part of this operation. And that was what I was trained for the better part of the last couple of years of my life. However, the reality of the war came very quick. My first son was born a month into the deployment, and I didn't really see him for a year. So, the excitement really faded, which I think is quite often the case with war for soldiers. With regards to the threat from Saddam Hussein, I think I was an early doubter in that regard. I had studied Arabic, as you mentioned, and I had already been to the Middle East. I am an avid follower to today of the news and what's going on. And we just watched the justifications changing as the administration was throwing things out there and seeing what stuck. At first it was terrorism, then it was WMD, democracy. And I think as that really dragged on, the soldiers ourselves weren't really clear why we were there. And I think is a little bit a mix of an ideology about transforming the Middle East, and that kind of got taken along with some of the think tanks and the contractors. So I don't think Saddam Hussein was a real threat to the United States. And I think in retrospect, we can say the entire narrative behind the war was dubious at best.
Dubious at best. Was there a point when you were actually just convinced that something was wrong with U.S. policy in Iraq? You mentioned some of the contractors, what you saw going on there. And then what did you see it all doing to Iraqi society?
From my own standpoint, I could safely say that it was immediately apparent that something was wrong. My unit drove from Kuwait to Baghdad without doors on the Humvee. So the main threat at that time was roadside bombs. And there I am driving 600 kilometers without any protection or doors. So that indicated to me that something was really wrong in the planning. And it appeared that the administration was more, they prioritized the optics of not having too many soldiers and reducing casualties to an acceptable level. And I think, a lot of these decisions that were directing the war were really taken through the lens of domestic policy. And I think that is very dangerous. But if we look at the Iraqi side, I think it was also quite apparent early on that the Iraqis didn't want us there. We weren't greeted as liberators, and our presence really inflamed some deep ethnic and religious differences in the countries. Some of the terrorist groups that came to Iraq, ironically after the invasion, exploited that. And I think the local population really paid the brunt of that. And some really, really disturbing things happened in that period to otherwise innocent people. I don't think the administration understood the culture, the language, or the history, or the religion, and they were blinded by their own political ideology and perhaps profits. The result was a fracturing of the society, which is still trying to define its national identity to today.
Well, before the Twin Tower attacks, September 11th, 1973, marked a different, rather ominous day, the beginning of the Pinochet military dictatorship in Chile. At the height of the Cold War, Salvador Allende, Chile's first democratically elected president, came to power, only to be deposed in a military coup after 3 years in office. General Augusto Pinochet pledged to restore order amid a spiraling economic crisis, But his regime also brought brutal repression. Tens of thousands of people were tortured, executed, and forcibly disappeared during his 17-year reign. Half a century later, there are around 1,300 active criminal cases for human rights violations during his dictatorship. And the U.S. still hasn't declassified documents relating to its role in the coup d'etat.
I hope that, in the long run, when the debris and controversies pass, I hope that two things remain. One, the declaration of the 4 living former presidents, committing us to the care and respect for democracy, and the unrestricted appreciation of the human rights of looking to the future, regardless of the differences we may have had in the past.
That was Gabriel Boric, who came to power last year following massive protests over inequality. Now, the leftist leader is facing an economic slowdown and split legislature. It's against this backdrop that, according to polling, Chileans appear to be losing faith in their democracy and even reappraising Pinochet's complicated legacy.
To me, everyone is a communist, but we had 17 years of glory, and my General Pinochet represents freedom, represents heroism. And we, in these days, we the women, keep on fighting so this communism does not enter our motherland.
So 50 years later, why does Pinochet still polarize Chile? Sergio Bitar, a former detainee of the regime, explains.
You cannot put together the brutality of the coup, the violations of human rights, and then discuss if you have to peg the dollar, the peso, what's the level of fiscal deficit. So, but at the same time, I can say the following. I recognize that there were mistakes in the economic policy of the Popular Unity. The aim was to distribute the power, economic power. It was such level of poverty impressive at the time. But nothing can justify an economic policy for a coup to take place as it took place. That's one point. Second, so you have to condemn that. So economic policies, social policies, public policies, you solve them through a democracy. Then, after the coup, the military, a very brutal opening of the economy, control of the fiscal deficit, and they provoked major unemployment and poverty. So the question there is, could you do that without a dictatorship? How do you do that?
Okay.
So I think you have to, but you cannot justify what was done in economics without considering that you couldn't do it in a democracy. You had to press the
understood.
people. And
I'll tell you what, we're down, unfortunately, to our last few minutes. Fernando, I'll ask you today, how well has or is reconciliation actually going in Chile? Because you still have many who do believe that Pinochet was somehow a savior for the country. You still hear people today speaking about how the military stopped Chile from becoming another Cuba, and that it's still one of the strongest and most stable economies in Latin America. Do you think that's fair?
I think that is partially true, because in 1973, the country was divided. 50% of the population was supporting Allende and 50% was against the government. That doesn't mean that people want a military coup with that brutality that happened. But before that, if somebody can be blamed, it's not the University of Chicago. It's a group of Chilean economists that were following Milton Friedman theories. And the opportunity for Mr. Friedman was to have a big lab, because Chile was a kind of laboratory. Anywhere happened what was made in Chile with the reform. At the same time that they were killing people, they imposed reform to privatize the big industry, to privatize the public companies, to do a lot of things, to manipulate dollars, whatever. We didn't have an independent central bank at that time, etc., etc., etc. Having said that, I will add that today Chile is not reconciliated. Why? Because in my personal opinion, the main responsible for that, what happened in Chile, was the armed forces. The same day they appear on the TV, the four generals from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the police to justify the coup. We had to wait 30 years, but the first time the chief of the army say that will never happen again. They gave some shy justification.
Well, that's all for this week's review of our newsmakers. Thanks so much for joining us. And remember to follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.